Hi everybody. Welcome to our channel, The Scary Tales. Our scary and horror stories are designed to send chills down your spine. Enjoy the spine-tingling stories thrill. Here's your horror stories about hospital. 1. The Whispering Room. A nurse working the night shift in an old hospital wing noticed that one of the rooms, room 213, always felt colder than the rest. Despite the heating system being functional, a chill would fill the air every time she passed by it. She heard strange whispers and soft footsteps, but when she checked the room, it was always empty. One night, curiosity got the better of her, and she entered the room to investigate. As soon as she did, the whispers stopped. The nurse turned to leave, only to find herself locked in. She screamed for help, but no one could hear her. Later, it was discovered that room 213 had been the site of a tragic incident years ago, where a patient had died under mysterious circumstances. Some say the patient's restless spirit still lingers, trying to find peace. 2. The Eyes in the Ceiling. A man had been in a coma for several weeks, and his condition was slowly improving. During his recovery, he started mentioning seeing eyes watching him from the ceiling. His family thought he was just delirious from the medication. However, as he got better, his descriptions became more detailed. He talked about how the eyes would follow him, sometimes even blinking. One day, after a few months, he was finally discharged, but not long after, another patient was admitted to the same room. They started experiencing the same strange phenomenon, describing eyes in the ceiling. It was only later that staff members discovered a hidden room above the ceiling, where old, forgotten hospital records were stored. The eyes. They were from old medical equipment that had been left behind. 3. The Doctor's Shadow. A young woman was recovering from surgery in the ICU when she noticed a strange figure moving in and out of the shadows. The figure looked like a doctor, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved, as if he didn't belong. The woman tried to call for help, but her voice couldn't break the silence. Every time she looked back at the figure, it would disappear, only to return when she wasn't looking. After several attempts to talk to the staff, she learned that the doctor she saw was not a real person. He was an apparition of a long-dead surgeon who had once worked at the hospital, and his shadow still haunted the halls, looking for his next patient to treat. 4. The Lost Patient. A hospital had a room where patients reported hearing soft crying noises in the middle of the night. Staff tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind or old pipes. However, one night, a nurse working the graveyard shift decided to investigate. She traced the sound to a seemingly abandoned room. The door was locked, but when she peeked through the small window in the door, she saw a figure, a patient lying in the bed. The nurse opened the door, only to find the room completely empty. Confused, she checked the hospital records. The room had been marked as vacant for years, and no patients had been assigned there recently. Later, after asking around, she learned that a young patient had disappeared from the hospital years ago, and their body was never found. The whispers and crying were believed to be their restless spirits still searching for help. 5. The Doctor's Return. A small-town hospital had a doctor who was known for his excellence and devotion to his patients. But one fateful night, he disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to him, and eventually, the hospital hired a replacement. Years passed, but strange things began happening late at night. Patients would complain about a doctor who seemed to be tending to them, but no one could find him when asked. One night, a new nurse was working and saw the mysterious doctor performing surgery in an operating room. The nurse called for help, but when the staff arrived, the room was empty. The doctor had never been found, and hospital records showed he died in a car accident years ago. Still, some claim that on certain nights, the doctor returns to continue his work, as though he never left. 6. The Shadows in the Hallway. There was a hallway in an old wing of the hospital that no one dared to walk down after dark. Staff whispered about the eerie happenings, where shadows would move of their own accord, slipping along the walls. One night, a young intern, eager to prove himself, volunteered to walk down the hall alone. As he made his way down, the air grew colder, and he began hearing faint footsteps behind him. When he turned around, there was nothing there, but the shadows seemed to grow larger and closer. By the time he reached the end of the hall, he could see figures standing in the shadows, watching him. Terrified, he ran back to the nurse's station, but when he asked about the figures, the staff told him that they were former patients who had passed away in the hospital years ago, their spirits forever trapped in the corridor. Now, new staff avoid the hall at all costs. 7. The Patient Who Never Left. A young man had been admitted to a hospital after a severe car accident, his body broken and battered. He was placed in a private room, and for weeks, the staff watched as he slowly improved. But then strange things began happening. His condition would mysteriously worsen every night, only to improve again during the day. Nurses started noticing something even more disturbing when they entered his room. He would be sitting up in bed, staring at them, but the moment they left, he would be back under the covers, as if he'd never moved. One night, a nurse decided to investigate. She opened the door to his room, only to find the bed completely empty. Panicking, she checked the room and found the man standing by the window, staring outside with hollow eyes. It was then she realized he had died days ago, but his spirit was still haunting the room. His body had never left. 8. The Forgotten Ward. A hospital was in the process of updating its records, and during renovations, workers found a series of old, dusty rooms that had been completely forgotten. They were labeled as an old psychiatric ward, but the doors had been locked for decades. Curious, a group of staff members ventured inside, hoping to explore the abandoned area. As they opened the doors to one of the rooms, they felt a cold chill rush over them. The room was filled with old furniture, but everything was still eerily well preserved. As they examined the space, they found old journals and photographs of patients who had been locked away in the ward, some with terrifying expressions, others with no faces at all. But the scariest discovery was a journal entry dated just a few years ago, where the writer described hearing scratching sounds coming from the walls. The entry ended with the phrase, "We're still here, waiting." 9. The Midnight Surgery. A nurse was working a late-night shift when a frantic doctor rushed into the ER, claiming that a patient needed emergency surgery immediately. The nurse was confused, no such patient had been scheduled, and the doctor seemed strange, almost frantic. The nurse followed him into the operating room, where the doctor began preparing for the surgery. As the nurse set up the tools, she noticed something unsettling. The patient on the operating table had a blank, pale face, and their body seemed unnaturally still. The doctor muttered to himself as he began the procedure, but the nurse was horrified when she saw that the patient's body was starting to move of its own accord, jerking slightly, as if alive. When she looked away and then back again, the room was empty, the patient was gone, and the doctor had vanished too. The nurse ran out in a panic and was told that no surgeries had been scheduled that night, and the doctor she'd seen was never found. Some say the ghost of a doctor who had died in that same ER years ago still performs his last surgery on the souls of the living. 10. The Unmarked Bed. A woman was recovering from a major surgery in a busy hospital when she started noticing strange occurrences at night. Every time the lights went out and the ward grew quiet, she could hear someone moving around her bed. At first, she thought it was just the nurses checking on her, but when she asked them the next morning, they all denied entering her room at night. This continued for several nights. One evening, as she lay awake, she saw a figure in the corner of her room, an elderly man with hollow eyes, standing at the foot of her bed. Terrified, she tried to call for help, but no sound came from her throat. The figure slowly walked towards her, vanishing just before he reached her. The next morning, she asked a nurse about the man. To her shock, the nurse explained that a patient had died in that very bed years ago. No one had occupied it since. The unmarked bed had remained empty, yet every night, the spirit returned. The end.